Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where today we examine controversial decisions of the UK government in dealing with the COVID pandemic. Vaccine policy is recommended by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI. And in surprise and heavily caveated advice last week, the committee recommends a deferral of consideration of offering COVID vaccines to secondary school children.
Should the government wish to consider vaccination of children and young adults aged less than 18 years with the primary aim of reducing the SARS-CoV-2 infection rate, asymptomatic and symptomatic cases, irrespective of other direct or indirect benefits as discussed above, the known benefits from vaccination are likely to be limited. In this instance, JCVI favours deferral of a universal offer of vaccination until more data have accrued, including a clearer understanding of the impact of COVID-19 in the UK within the context of a successful adult vaccination programme.
However, many scientists disagree, and even more strikingly, so does most international advice in high vaccinated countries, including the policymakers in America, Germany, New Zealand and the Netherlands. The position is particularly pressing in Scotland, where the schools go back in a mere 3 weeks, and where recent comparisons between the Scottish and English rates of infection strongly suggest that schools have been the key vector of transmission of the virus. Scotland's rate of COVID transmission was higher than England until the Scottish schools went off on holiday and then was quickly overtaken by the English rate, where the schools were still in session. In today's show, we talked to two key experts from north and south of the border about the government's decision-making on vaccination. Dr. Chris Smith, the top Cambridge virologist, has become a household name during the pandemic, while Professor Sir Harry Burns, formerly the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, is President of the British Medical Association. But first, to your tweets, emails and messages in response to our recent shows featuring Scottish authors Andrew Neil MacLeod and Murray Armstrong, and New Zealand epidemiologist Professor Michael Baker and Dr. Bharat Pinkhania of Exeter University. First, in relation to our authors, Dalrymple says, really interesting show. Many thanks to all contributors. Claire Conlon says, fabulous interview with Andrew Neil MacLeod. I am definitely buying his book and I wish him all the best with Netflix. Loved his comment to Alex at the end. Arthur McMillan says, insofar as the Enlightenment, Scots were fundamental in the formation of American politics. One must ask, with the benefit of hindsight, how did that pan out? Arthur goes on to say, all history should be available in schools to everyone interested about everything, whether you like it or no. And finally, on our authors, Anita with a special message to Andrew's wife says, Amber, love it, your husband was great, and so say all of us. Then moving on to our show on COVID and vaccinations, Gordon Mackenzie says, when I was in school many years ago, we got vaccinated at school. I remember long lines of kids getting jabs one by one. There was no problem with the strategy back then. Would it be a problem now? Linda says, great topic, Alex, for bringing up the sheer incompetence of Boris Johnson. Anissa says, well, I, for one, will be continuing to wear my mask. And finally, Kevin says, we must, Anita. It is our only protection. Now, Dr. Chris Smith of the Naked Scientist platform has become a household name during the pandemic. No one better explains the behaviour of this coronavirus.
Dr. Chris Smith, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Pleasure.
Now, Chris Smith, we have this situation where high vaccinated countries like Israel and America are now vaccinating school children, certainly secondary school children, but the UK advice is not. How do we explain this?
Well, we've waited a long time for the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, to pronounce their verdict on this. And many of us suspected they probably would say, because our regulator, the MHRA, had endorsed and pronounced safe the use of vaccines in 12 to 16-year-olds, and we have other major jurisdictions like the US, other European countries like France, and other countries elsewhere in the world, like Israel, as you say, that have gone down the path of saying these vaccines are safe and we're going to use them, and they are indeed using them, in young people. So we assume that we would probably follow suit. And the argument in favour of doing that is that if you've got a population and you want to vaccinate as many people as possible, this will translate into a reduction in spread of the virus, especially in the new school year, in the autumn, when we know that everything becomes much more common in the autumn because that's when seasonal infections tend to surge. and there will be knock-on repercussions of that. The JCVI, on the other hand, have said they're not going to support that course of action, and they cite as one reason for that, in their cost-benefit analysis, the low risk of some side effects. Out of nearly 200 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, which has been approved for this age group being given, and the Moderna vaccine, which works the same way, there's a couple of hundred cases of a myocarditis, an inflammation in the heart. Well, that puts the frequency of that side effect at about 1 in a million. That, though, is about the same as the risk of you getting a severe dose of coronavirus if you're that age. So you can see why there's a tension for them. They're protecting young people from something with a risk profile that's sort of the same frequency as the side effects of the vaccine. But the wider protection isn't being taken into account. So I think it's a difficult decision. I can see why they've made it, but I would personally have supported encouraging anyone who's 12 and up getting a jab, because I think it will contribute to our ability long-term to control the virus.
So you can see why Professor Adam Finn of the JCVI would say that the risk to children is vanishingly small. But it's less easy to explain about the risk of infectivity across the population, given that the JCVI is recommending that JAGs be given to children who have a vulnerable adult in their household. How do we explain that contradiction?
Well, speaking to the BBC on Saturday, Adam Finn was asked about the rationale behind doing this, and he made precisely the point that, as the statistics show, you're about as likely to be hit by lightning as you are to get a severe dose of COVID if you're a child. Children also tend to spread coronavirus a bit less well, but not zero, than older people, and they do not suffer from severe side effects of coronavirus. But what they could do is, of course, take the infection home and introduce it through the household unit to other more vulnerable people. And at the same time, remember that we have seen encouragement of use of the vaccines in vulnerable children. So we are going to be vaccinating children who are judged to be particularly vulnerable. We're just not vaccinating children en masse at the moment.
But in the last few weeks, haven't we seen an indication that the schools are a vector of infection? I mean, the Scottish infectivity rate was higher than England's. The Scottish schools, where the holidays are earlier than England, go out 3 or 4 weeks ago, and suddenly the Scottish rate drops below England. Has there been any study to look at the comparison between Scottish and English schools to establish whether that is true?
I'm not sure whether anyone's looked specifically at whether there is a relationship between the school year in Scotland versus in England and cases of coronavirus, but certainly we have looked for decades, in previous decades, at the issue of whether the school year drives surges in seasonal infections, and it absolutely does. I mean, there's a really good body of research that shows that children going to school, mixing at school, it's a giant crucible for infections. We know that the school year is a potent driver, and that is actually why the UK government have said, well, we're going to have Freedom Day when we're going to have Freedom Day, because it will overlap strongly with when schools are off.
And that would be supported by the fact that last week 1 million school children in England were pinged off, or self-isolating because of classmates or teachers who'd been identified with coronavirus. I mean, if the schools weren't a vector of infection, why were 1 million children back at home last week?
Well, I think 1 million workers are also back at home this week, aren't they? And we've got companies like Felixstowe Docks organisations like Felixstowe Docks saying that they're almost on the cusp of not being able to operate. We've got certain other operators that have said we're just going to have to shut up shop at the moment because we do not have enough staff to run our business safely or effectively. This is being dubbed the pingdemic.
Now, as a virologist who understands the behaviour of viruses, and particularly this potent, highly infectious new strain of coronavirus, what was your personal reaction when you saw these scenes of revellers in nightclubs celebrating Freedom Day or going down the Thames in pleasure boats last week? I mean, what was sort of personal when you looked at that? Was you saying, what on earth is going on?
Well, it's a pressure relief valve, isn't it? And this is telling us that there's a lot of pressure in the boiler. There's a considerable head of steam. And young people feel that they've been robbed not of 1, but 2 summers almost now, and they're desperate to get back to some semblance of normality. That said, I hope that people will remain responsible and accept that we're not out of the woods, as we keep being told by politicians. It hasn't gone away. We have got lots of cases. But what I find reassuring is that the cases are currently cropping up in younger people and chiefly in unvaccinated people. And that means that if we carry on the way we're going, which is to have a strong push towards vaccinating everybody, then we have a fair chance of actually really suppressing down numbers so that it remains manageable. We all accept that the virus is not going to go away. It will become endemic. It will continue to circulate. But what we need to do is to convert it from what could be a lethal infection for some into a fairly trivial infection for everyone.
But is there an international precedent for a country with a partially vaccinated population opening up restrictions into the teeth of a pandemic?
I don't think so, which is why we're being described as a unique experiment by a number of commentators. Even the WHO have said that this is a dubious state of affairs, that if we don't use the advantages being handed to us at the present time, which is a very heavily vaccinated, albeit with some way to go, adult population, the summer, the end of the school year, people going away on holiday, so fewer people in the workplace, on public transport and so on, then we're coinciding with a drop in pressure on the NHS anyway. This gives us a window of opportunity. If we don't move now and try this, then we are absolutely committed to not doing this until at least next spring.
Often we've come to believe that the virus behaviour, as they become more infectious, they become less potent and less deadly. Is that still a hope and expectation of this coronavirus, or alternatively, are we going to get ever more threatening and ever more potent deviant strains of the virus?
Well, the reason we've got a problem with this Delta variant is it's more infectious. It can surmount pre-existing immunity, and it can surmount pre-existing immunity conferred by vaccination. So you've got something that spreads better, and it gets through previous pre-existing defences, which means that if you're a vulnerable person, it doesn't have to be a nastier virus. It's just the mere fact that it's infected you that means if you get lots of infections, you'll still get people who have consequences of those infections at a big level, at least until you get enough people who are sufficiently immune in the population that they become less vulnerable to that effect. So really, we don't know at the moment. And you never say never in medicine, because if you do, you will be caught out.
So, Dr. Smith, one thing people are referring to, because of the conditions of social restrictions and lockdowns, other viruses, not just coronavirus, have obviously been suppressed. Can we now expect an upsurge of some of our more familiar viruses to also threaten us this coming autumn and winter?
We're already seeing that happening, and we have already seen that happen in some other countries. The usual seasonal suspects, viruses like RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, viruses like para-influenza, para-flu, they're already causing a problem in some places and in significant amounts. And there are several reasons for that. One, they're coming back because people are mixing more, and these viruses transmit through close personal contact. So you tend to see more cases as you ease lockdowns, and they're endemic infections. The other worry is that with time of not being exposed to these things, people will have lost some of their immunity to them, certainly among older people, and there is therefore a theoretical risk that because of that slippage in immune response, some of them may come back and produce more profound, more significant illness, particularly this winter, and people are particularly concerned about the flu, either this year or in forthcoming years, because A, flu's completely gone off our radar. We have seen so few cases that it's much harder to track how the virus is changing, what it's doing, what it's actually going to rematerialise as, and therefore whether the vaccines are going to be effective against it is more of an unknown, and at the same time people are losing their immunity. So therefore there is potentially the threat of a big flu season, which is why governments in many, many countries are really pushing flu vaccination, and they've brought down the age at which in some countries that people are being vaccinated against the flu as a safeguard against that.
Dr. Chris Smith, thank you so much for joining me again on the
Pleasure.
Alex Salmond Show.
Coming up after the break, Alex interviews Professor Sir Harry Burns. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Professor Sir Harry Burns is both President of the British Medical Association and a world-leading public health expert.
Harry, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you. Pleasure.
This advice from last week from the GCVI, this long-awaited advice saying don't vaccinate the school kids. How do you explain that when countries like Israel, America, highly vaccinated countries are saying, vaccinate the school kids? What's going on?
I'm not entirely clear what the basis of the JCVI advice was. I know I've certainly heard some reports of younger kids in some of these countries becoming ill. Now, whether or not it was the vaccine that made them ill, there was enough. My colleagues from abroad have said there was enough concern about it that they weren't entirely 100% comfortable with vaccinating young children. If we could be sure of the safety, then obviously it would make a lot of sense to vaccinate them, because school rooms, difficult to socially distance, difficult to ventilate in older buildings and so on. Mask wearing, maybe not so good for younger children. It would be a hotbed for transmitting virus from one child to another, and the child takes it back home, and the parents then become infected, or maybe the grandparents and so on. So it would be good to do it, but we should only do it when JCVI is absolutely sure of the safety of it, because the last thing you want to do is to damage a child who is maybe at low risk of getting coronavirus anyway.
But if the committee felt that the vaccine was unsafe for children, then why would they be advising it for children with certain conditions, and indeed for children where the adults at home are particularly vulnerable to the virus? So why would be advising it for some children and not others if it was felt to be unsafe?
I can only imagine it's a risk-benefit choice that they're making. If the risk is greater, then the benefit is greater if they vaccinate it. I mean, at the moment, I think it may be that some of the anxiety is about the fact that children haven't been exposed to an awful lot of the vaccine, and therefore they're not sure they can say with certainty that the risk is very small. So, I think they're playing it safe. I haven't seen data on complications. I've just heard anecdotally about children who've had some thrombotic complications and so on. But they really have to get the data and sort that out.
We have to get cracking, because we're only 3 weeks away now from the Scottish schools going back in our timetable.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think we may well know a bit more about what things are happening in the next 3 weeks.
But in the absence of vaccinating, let's say the school children and the teachers, still some, is there any other measure that parents can take to make their children safer if they're going to school into an unvaccinated environment?
Well, things like regular testing of pupils and teachers and so on might work, but that's a hard policy to implement. You don't know if people are testing properly. Lateral flow tests are not entirely accurate and so on. I think that the teachers need to be vaccinated, the older pupils need to be vaccinated, and we need to see what is happening to younger children and let JCVI decide about vaccinations lower down the age range. I absolutely accept the fact that not vaccinating the kids is a hard decision, but I don't see any reason other than safety not to do it, to be honest. And somebody somewhere must be asking questions about the safety of it. And if JCVI is saying don't do it yet, then they can't have answered the question. So masks, distancing, and these kind of things are the things that we have to rely on at the moment while we get the data on the safety of the vaccine for younger children.
But from a public health perspective, I mean, over the last few weeks, I mean, I went to the England-Scotland game at Wembley 2 or 3 weeks ago, and there was 12,000 fans there. It was all, you had to be double tested before you got in. The whole thing was conducted with impeccable rigour. But 2 or 3 weeks later, there's 60,000 in Wembley for the final. There's 30,000 a day at the Open Golf. There's 140,000 at the Grand Prix. I mean, aren't these sort of things just asking for trouble?
Correct. They absolutely are. You know, a lot of these things, you're outside, and being outside is better than being inside, particularly if it's sunny. The ultraviolet seems to have a depressing effect on the infectivity of the virus. But what is really worrying me is this is reopening the nightclubs down in England. I mean, that's just daft. I could use a stronger word, but I won't.
From a public health perspective, when you assess what your former colleagues have been doing with north and south of the border and the other countries of the United Kingdom, how would you basically assess the performance of the government on public health? Is it A minus, or is it somewhere near gamma?
Well, you might want to ask Dominic Cummings that as far as England is concerned, but you and I both know that professional advisors are there to advise politicians. And I was very fortunate during the flu pandemic because the professional politicians listened and did the right thing. And I think by and large, that's what's happened this time in Scotland. I get the sense that the same thing is happening in Wales. Northern Ireland, I'm not so sure about. I haven't heard too much about that yet. But there is a discomfort in my medical colleagues that they've been working really, really hard for 18 months, that the lifting of restrictions down there is going to lead to another surge, and that the UK government hasn't actually listened to what they're being told by the medical profession particularly. And the other thing is that a lot of my medical colleagues are worried about what's happening to people with cancer and heart disease and so on who need other treatment. If the beds are getting full again, then that will delay treatment for other things that are potentially curable or modifiable, and people are going to suffer. So suppressing this as much as we can, as soon as we can, is important. I absolutely recognise the economic arguments and so on, but I've got absolutely no sympathy with the idea that we can open up nightclubs and all that kind of thing and let everyone run riot and spread the virus. That is damaging.
And very finally, Harry, are we going to see the re-emergence of some of our familiar old enemies who've been suppressed by the lockdown, etc., the flu and a range of other viruses? And is that a concern to you? Or alternatively, will the better public health habits that some of us have picked up and will continue with, will that help us in the long term against these more familiar foes?
Well, last year, of course, we saw hardly any flu because the way in which you suppress flu is you wear masks and you socially distance and you wash your hands and so on. It's a good way of dealing with viruses generally. So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if coronavirus became the new flu. If enough people get vaccinated, the severity of coronavirus will be less, we hope. And in the 1918 flu pandemic, literally hundreds of millions of people around the world died of flu, and flu began to produce different subtypes which were less serious and so on, and that's what we live with every winter. And it might be that coronavirus falls into the same pattern. We get vaccinated, therefore it becomes less severe, and every year we get a booster shot dependent on the strain of coronavirus that's circulating, and we have it with our flu vaccine, and that's what's been planned for this year, and that's absolutely correct.
Well, Sir Harry Burns, on that fairly optimistic look at the future, which we all hope will come to pass. Thank you very much indeed for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Pleasure.
To vaccinate or not to vaccinate older school children? That is the question. The JCVI decision to defer a decision has provoked consternation among some experts. In terms of vaccine safety, they point to the strong advice from other regulatory authorities. In terms of public health, they point to the evidence of schools as a key vector of infection and the unknown impact of long COVID amongst children, even following a mild initial infection. Most disturbing is the thought that Scottish schools are returning within weeks, around 1 month before their English counterparts. That means children will be returning to a largely unvaccinated environment, which in turn suggests high rates of infection in the population and continued disruption of the school timetable. Now, none of these are easy decisions to make, but to govern is to choose. Deferral of a decision until after the Scottish secondary schools are back seems the worst of all options. A non-decision, a cop-out, perhaps at the expense of children and their families. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.